Hey, good morning everybody. This is Marty, your instructor. Happy week 3 of the course, Cultural Diversity in the Modern World. Today I have a couple slides just to get us going and get you to focus on some of the key points in the readings for the week. So far, again, I want to thank all of you for the work you've done so far. I really appreciate the level of engagement, and I think by today I should be done grading the first or second set of responses that you gave in the discussion for weeks. I think I'm done with week 1. I got to grade week 2, so I'll have that done hopefully by today, which is Tuesday, the 4th of September. So for today, in this brief presentation, a discussion of cultural diversity, details on ethnographic portraits and vignettes, which are basically short stories that anthropologists and emerging anthropologists put together after doing research or field work, the readings, Pierre and Kovac, and then the video, which was assigned Stories We Tell. I have a couple comments, thoughts about that, and then I'll briefly give you an update on the self-guided field trips, the instructions, which were uploaded yesterday in Canvas. Okay, to begin with, a couple points, and this is just to make sure that the traditional hegemonic way of thinking about cultural diversity involves certain elements. For example, cultural diversity tends to refer to variations in institutions, traditions, language, customs, rituals, beliefs, and value. It also involves respect and appreciation for differences along, and then all these different sort of identity categories: ethnic, racial, gender, class, faith-based, and regional lines. So again, the point is to unpack, demystify the traditional approach to cultural diversity. Cultural diversity also refers to the protection, promotion, and maintenance of cultural diversity. Actually, let me rephrase that. The protection, promotion, and maintenance of cultural diversity are an essential requirement for sustainable development for the benefit of present and future generations. So in other words, if you talk about an entity or an industry, let's say institutions of higher learning, and you want to have a long-term sustainable plan of development, it helps to ensure there's diversity along cultural lines so that the institution does two things: reflects the population where it's located and where the population is designed to serve, and then also it tries to meet the internal mission or the overall mission and goal of the institution, which is to promote diversity. Typically, if you look at any mission for an entity, whether a university or a corporation or a nonprofit group, they usually have diversity as one of the key elements. Cultural diversity, another point, approaches to culturally competent social science research and creative work. It involves how do we do culturally relevant scholarship and arts-based academic work. Most importantly, at the very bottom here, cultural competence refers to the routine application of culturally appropriate social science research and creative work. So in other words, as you do a project, you want to do as best you can with the foundation of the project, whether concepts and or participation of people, that it's appropriate along cultural lines. And I'll go into that later on in the presentation as we talk about activist research, which is one of the areas of focus for the week. So moving on. Now this is a slide and an area you may have to revisit periodically, especially later on in the course when you do the self-guided field trips, you do your final project, because stories or vignettes and portraits are the essence or the soul of the work of an ethnographer. So what these things are, here's a couple bullet points to emphasize what ethnographic portraits and vignettes are. And again, these are tools, resources, ways for you to present details on individuals and or issues that you become familiar with based on doing work in the field or in a setting unfamiliar to you. So these are personalized accounts of fleeting moments of field work in dramatic form. Ethnographic portraits and vignettes provide a glimpse into the ethnographer's own taken for granted understandings of the social world under scrutiny. In other words, they're not just a story about other people, but they tend to be a window into the assumptions and the biases of researchers and scholars. So there's stories that provide a nice vehicle to really get to the core of some of the observations and interpretations of an ethnographer. These are also portraits of the conduct of an event of everyday life to enhance the contextual richness of ethnographic work. One way to think about portraits and vignettes, if you look at a presenter, whether a professor, a leader in the community, typically there's this moment of going off script to tell a story. Those stories, depending on how they unfold, typically can be referred to as portraits or vignettes. They're these anecdotes that kind of enhance our understanding of the core material being discussed. And the intention of a portrait or vignette is to elicit emotional identification and understanding, to bring life to research and bring research to life. In other words, people typically say, in my effort to humanize this issue, I would like to present a portrait or a vignette that actually relays information of an actual person. Of course, you don't typically use the real name, and you don't provide details that could get the person in trouble, but you give enough information for people to have a good understanding of the situation. People create these portraits and vignettes to humanize their work. And they're a nice break from all the heavy, dense material of just relaying findings from research. They're also called microethnographies. They're derived from your field notes, your diaries, and your free writing. They involve, as I said earlier, self-introspection and an interactive introspection. And the bottom line is they give the reader a sense of being there in the scene. So we'll probably come back to this more and more, because what you're asked to do in many of the assignments in the course, the final project, including the 2 self-guided field trips, is you are putting together these moments, these portraits of a problem based on your activities, your engagement, your findings, and I would think at the very least you want to humanize the issue while being self-reflective. Okay, one of the readings, Pierre, titled Activist Groundings, it's important because in a course on cultural diversity, at least the way I approach it, I want to ensure that people are given a clear understanding of this approach, this philosophy of research that involves more than just the objective individual collecting information for the sake of knowledge production. So in terms of diversity of approaches, so not just cultural diversity, but diversity of strategies of doing academic work, the activist area is interesting, it's complex, and it's important to me in terms of how we understand diversity. So Pierre, the author, examines 2 things: how the study of racialization can be considered a site of political engagement with the community and, in many senses, activists. Number 2, how positionality and global relations of power intersect and form the basis of activist research and strategies. So if you go through the article, she focuses on these 2 areas. There's her own engagement as a Haitian African American, and being in Ghana, and the things that come up in terms of her trying to understand race and the structures that facilitate and generate discourses about race. And then she also kind of intervenes in what does it mean to be activists. Does it mean aligning yourselves with a social movement, or is it just a way of framing your approach and having some kind of liberatory political agenda? And just so we understand some of these terms which are going to be reoccurring, racialization, which is one of the core concepts and processes that the author discusses, it's a complex, contradictory process through which groups come to be designated as being of a particular race and, on that basis, subjected to differential and or unequal treatment. So this is a process we are all engaged in to different degrees, and it's something, as we get into the other modules about race and culture, you'll find it's something that is useful to try to make sense of some of the problems and solutions people are looking at. Now, one of the questions the author poses, as a researcher committed to global racial and social justice, how do I negotiate my many experiences of discourses and practices that ensure the continued privileging of whiteness in this society. So in other words, we have a environment, we have a setting, according to the author, where there's a idea to promote global racial and social justice. And as one seeks to do that through research, through advocacy, how do you also try to critically interrogate whiteness, white privilege, which are things that are extremely toxic for many of us for different reasons, because either we're unclear about what it is, or there's this issue that it doesn't relate to me. But this is a useful term to be, number one, transparent, and to also be helpful to individuals that may not be in a position to assert their rights or achieve equity because of structures that are working against them. Now, the author, or another author, McClintock, suggests white privilege refers to an invisible package of unearned assets which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. And then lastly, according to the author, activist engagement in scholarly work is, according to the author, so here's a definition. What does it mean to be activist and engaged in a research project? It's an integrated process as a combination of positionality, experience, and politics. So in other words, it's this convergence of your own position in society, and then having some kind of political goal, whether it's the promotion of equity, the promotion of racial justice, or something else that you see as a priority in terms of your own political interests. Moving on to the next reading, Kovac. Doing indigenous methodologies. What's interesting about this approach of the author, I thought, and again, these are some of the points I pulled out which I thought were really important. You, as you read them, bring in your own baggage, will find things interesting, useful, and compelling to understand diversity. The format of the chapter is a letter to students. And the author focuses on key aspects of indigenous methodologies. So why I thought the format was innovative and necessary to talk about, because I have a collection of a few digital stories, visual projects, scholarly videos that use this format. And so I'll post them, I'll dig them up and post them and make sure to draw your attention to them. But it's a creative way to illuminate knowledge in a way above and beyond a traditional story. So in other words, writing a story like to yourself. One that format that's new to me is a Dear John letter, which I guess is a letter to break up with someone. And one student broke up with Colfax. And so she did a digital story about her detaching herself from Colfax because she didn't like how it was just becoming busy and all cement without trees. So I'll revisit that later. But the author's key points when you talk about indigenous methodologies, it requires comprehension of tribal knowledge systems and how indigenous epistemology fits within that. So what we're talking about here is a very specific instance of trying to look at the knowledge of other people, the non-dominant societal members, and figuring out how to, on an equal playing field, integrate some of their practices, not co-opt or appropriate, but work in collaboration in a way that is consistent with their approaches to knowledge and their values. Indigenous methodologies, according to the author, requires a grasp of indigenous theory principles, which outline the teachings, laws, and values inherent in indigenous beliefs, in the indigenous belief system. Also, there's a consideration of relationships at the basis of research strategies and methods. The subtext here is this idea of the lone social scientist, the lone researcher on their own, going somewhere and milking people for data to then help with theoretical construction or conceptual development, or just in general promoting some kind of generalizations of a particular cultural group. That's okay, but it's not the best way to approach this area of indigenous methodologies. What you want to do is look at the relationships, the social interactions that happen in a project, and those relationships are fundamental to tribal knowledge systems, which in your own lives it's the same. I have been known to say it's not really what you know, but who you know in life. And so that's sort of a crass way of saying that the relationships you have between people, whether new or existing contacts, are at the basis of who we are as people and very valuable to us and meaningful, or they could be. Another point, there's attention to restoring or interpretation and representation. And this is probably one of the most important lines or take-home messages. There's a urgency to create space for people to retell stories about themselves. Not an urgency for Marty or you to go and tell stories about other people, but to work in collaboration with others where there is space, a safe space created, where people tell the stories that they want to share and that they're comfortable with. And then of course there's ethical issues of how to ensure the stories are disseminated in an appropriate way and people aren't portrayed in a way that maybe is harmful to them. And so we're going to revisit this a lot, this idea of restoring or story sharing, because it's a key issue in terms of how I approach diversity. And then also indigenous methodologies are about knowledge creation as well as healing and community building. Key point here is as you engage in any project, whether it's a write-up for the self-guided field trip or some larger project where you're interested in global health or whatever, what we want to do in terms of framing things is not just say we are interested to promote knowledge. You definitely don't want to say I want to help people. Okay, that is something that's really problematic in the sense that who are we to help other people? But what you could do is in a collaborative way, especially integrating indigenous methodologies, is to figure out how a scholarly project, how a research study can heal and build community in collaboration with community members. Not just, hey, Marty in Denver has created a model to help people in Central Africa live longer lives. Okay, that can be seen as paternalistic and furthering the agenda historically of dominant affluent countries sort of pushing their agenda on other people. So again, this is my take on some of these key issues regarding building relationships with people and building relationships with people in a way that can produce a collaborative project that benefits not just the researcher. Another key point by Kovac is this idea of the gaze. This is a huge issue in the area of cultural anthropology and social science generally, that this gaze, this being a spectator and having this like huge eye on other people and looking down at them, it is something that we're constantly trying to intervene into and try to ensure that we don't do it in a problematic way. So it typically means the Western white male intellectual materialist, tourist, and traveler sort of exoticizing other cultures. And us, meaning members of the dominant culture or one of the strongest countries in the world, not letting go of this idea that the way we do things is right. And as we have this lens looking at other people, we're judging them because they're not like us. So the gaze is something we're going to go back to a lot, and there's a couple questions to think of. Within your own gaze, so let's say that set of eyeglasses that you use to look at other cultures or your own culture, what do you see and what do you not see? And ideally, through your work in the course, you're going to demonstrate a decolonizing consciousness that is mindful of the gaze. It just means being transparent about your own positionality and how your own identity realities or identity categories influence what you see and don't see in the world around us. Okay, winding down, I want to go deeper into this idea of activist research that was introduced by Pierre. And there's some basic methodological steps. This is taken from an article by Charles Hale out of Austin, University of Texas, Austin. So a couple steps in terms of how do you do this. So it's arriving at research questions and objectives that have some kind of utility for individuals who are participants in a project. You want to set practical policy influential goals, and you want to discuss with potential study participants. In other words, this is a bit extreme, but this is a perfect example. If you're working on one of the projects in the course and you're looking at some issue at the community level, rather than design your project alone, consider early on at the concept level identifying a community partner, community member that can help you shape the project itself at the concept level. That's kind of what the point number one is. Point two, participatory research strategies. Integrate study participants not just as individuals that you milk data from, but as collaborators and potential co-authors. And that requires a lot of work and experience, but it's something that I think is good to strive for. And I have a good track record of actually writing chapters with individuals who are study participants. So it can be done, and I encourage you to think about this. And back to the course assignments, before you submit a assignment to me that involves some kind of community engagement activity, consider running by your paper, your draft video, or whatever you're working on by the actual individual or community that you're working with, to ensure that what you're presenting to me has integrity and it's done in a collaborative way. This is a lot easier said than done, but it's totally doable, and it takes time and not procrastinating. And I'm happy to work with you if you're interested in that. In terms of basic methodological steps, in terms of activist research, interpretation, and analysis of the data, you should do this in partnership with a community or project collaborators, and it's good to create a document which spells out the agreement of sharing data. Historically, academics have this bad track record of collecting data, and then the data will be sitting in a locked cabinet in an office and not made available to individuals in a community. So it's good to consider ownership of data that you collect, and the willingness on your part to share it and make it available to broader audiences than just a few people in the academic world. The way you disseminate research projects, there's a way to do it in an activist approach, and it typically means non-academic channels. So what are those community venues that you can look to share information and ensure you're not just producing a paper in a class and or just writing an article in a journal that many people can't access because you need a fee to subscribe. And lastly, how do you validate the research results? You want to create use-oriented basic research, and you should ask yourself, is the new knowledge useful? How do you know? This is called creating metrics, having some kind of assessment tool to think through whether or not the work you're doing is meeting your agenda to do activist or practical kinds of scholarly work. Now, of course, there are concerns about activist research. Three of them are, and of course you may think of your own concerns, and you should spell them out in the discussion in Canvas if it made sense. So what about when you're studying powerful people and institutions with whom you do not identify ethically or politically? In other words, let's say you're interested in economic development, and you work with a firm that's promoting gentrification to enhance neighborhoods and make certain areas in the city livable. And let's say you find that they're acting in an unethical manner. They're corrupt, or they have some kind of relationship with, let's say, a different corporation that is actually harming people. So how do you navigate those dilemmas? Number two, what if you uncover information or analysis that could be detrimental to or even perceived as unduly critical of the interests of the very people with whom you have developed a privileged relationship? In my own work in Central Africa with tobacco farmers and their family members, I was very interested in how families and their lives were harmed by the practices of U.S. cigarette companies and leaf buying companies. Now, some of my research, the fieldwork I conducted, showed that, of course, there's exploitation and there's unfortunate circumstances. Some of the things I learned, which were very disheartening, but it was, let's say, outside the scope of my interest or my research area, was how inside families themselves, which of course were being exploited, there was, let's say, domestic violence. And so that was a area that was not on my radar screen to analyze, but it definitely was something I saw a few times, or let's say I was told a few times by different individuals. But I purposely, because again, my framing of the issue, I kept that out of the analysis. And so in my research, I do claim, and I do see it as activist research. So that was one way how I handle it. Of course, you can spend a whole dissertation looking at domestic violence within a family that you're doing research on. And one of the reasons I did keep it out was because the local officials who are promoting tobacco industry interests and did not see the interests of families at heart, they claim that many of these tobacco farmers, they don't deserve labor rights, they're a bunch of drunks, they all beat their wives. And so there was some minor truth to that, but I was looking at a higher issue of how my role can be used to make visible the bad practices of tobacco companies, because many people around the world are harmed by the labor contracts and how the tobacco companies behave in other countries. So you can see it's complex, and I'd love your input on this. And number three, what if your research on both sides of a conflict requires that they perceive you as strictly neutral, objective, non-aligned, which goes contrary to your own ethical, political sensibilities? So the issue is here, if you see a toxic issue, a problem that's very complex, how do you portray yourself, if you need to, as being objective when in reality you maybe have a position? And so these are reoccurring things that come up when you do activist research. Okay, about the video, I hope you enjoy it. It's called Stories We Tell, and it's significant for many reasons. It's significant because it brings up different issues about stories and the value of stories. Again, you can look at a story as an ethnographic vignette or a portrait. And so this is a video that kind of unpacks in several ways key issues that are going to be ongoing when we talk about the crafting of stories, whether your own story or a portrait or ethnographic vignette or microethnography about other people. So the film is a docu-memoir. It's about an extended family's portrait of itself. Sarah, the key individual, the filmmaker, it's her attempt to discover her mother and weigh the impact of her mother's choices on her own sense of self. So in some way we all can relate, because if we look at your family, look at my family, if one was to do a documentary about some dramatic event or the inner workings of a family, there's certain secrets and there's certain lines that we maybe won't cross in terms of making things public. And so the whole film just follows Sarah and her effort to make sense of her mother's choices and how they affect Sarah's sense of herself. So you have Sarah, the stepfather, biological father, siblings, the mother's brother, and friends. So that's a quick summary of a couple of the key characters. So Sarah, the filmmaker, is the product of a clandestine love affair between Sarah's mom and Harry. Okay, so just to restate that, the filmmaker is the product of a clandestine love affair between Sarah's mom and Harry. So this is something, again, some families could relate to because of things that have happened where an affair was performed or a child is born out of wedlock. And so it makes for some good drama. And it's a key thread in the narrative. Now, Sarah admits in an email that she does not know where the project is going to take her. What I like about this is when we do a narrative, a story, an analysis, a vignette, a portrait, sometimes it's okay to not be in control and have uncertainty in terms of the direction things are going. And for me, I'm used to that. I don't have a problem with it. But for you, if you're maybe like to be in control, maybe suspend some of your feelings and try to develop your projects, whether your stories about yourself through the digital storytelling project or stories about people in the community. Like, it's okay if there's uncertainty. It'll all come together if you just sort of go through the motions in a thoughtful and conscious way. So the central conflict is between Sarah and her biological father around the question of what a story is, what a story does. In other words, what's the work of a story? And then, of course, who does the story belong to? Now, this will make more sense as you watch the film and go back to the slide and tack back and forth, because it'll bring up some key issues and get you to look more deeply at the video itself. And then lastly, our understanding and knowledge of self derives ultimately from the stories we are told, that we create and we tell others. In other words, stories, narratives that are co-produced, that are individually produced, that are our own, that are about other people, that sort of makes the world spin. And so they can be useful for activist research, because typically testimonials, propping up an important narrative to make a point, to educate others, is really powerful and can augment like more quantitative research that has just statistics. So stories tend to be making visible the lived reality of one statistic, and it can be very powerful because it pulls at the heartstrings and it has an emotional impact. So stories are very valuable for different reasons, as the video shows. Things to consider when interviewing community members. So now we're kind of going out of some of the core issues that were discussed in the readings, and then moving into practical tools when you are asked to talk to someone, interview them, have a conversation. So there's a couple things. What can we learn about our interviewees when we fail to make a connection or struggle to listen deeply? So in other words, how can we be good listeners and not just be in a conversation solely to get our questions answered? So at a human level, can you first connect to someone, be present, be generous with your time, and be a good listener, and then through that process develop a relationship or connection that then allows you to get at some really good information? Or number two, how can we become better community engaged oral historians? In other words, a historian through discussion, piecing together, stitching together some key issues that have happened in the past, using people's stories or working in collaboration with people, getting them to share stories. By negotiating, arriving at an ethical and intellectual balance between respecting community taboos and maintaining academic integrity. The issue here is ensuring that when you do engage in story sharing and collecting narratives, doing oral history, which is basically just talking to people and writing up some cool aspects of their life, that you are respectful of things, constraints that exist in the community in terms of what's ethical and not ethical about sharing stories. In other words, there's certain lines that you should and should not cross, and you really won't know until you talk to people who you're working with. And of course, there's tons of literature that explains some of the texture of these issues. And then lastly, how can we represent the people with whom we work, not just as collections of stories, but also as human beings? So key point here, my job working in collaboration with you is to ensure that you put together narratives, stories that make people seem as real as they can be, instead of just looking at them as data points or study subjects, which is a common term in academia that is problematic because the word subjects is very impersonal, and it creates a distance between us as like the scholar and people who are the subjects of research. So in other words, how do you humanize individuals? And really one of the best ways, building relationships with people, and of course being honest and being thoughtful and being willing to share part of your own life to then establish a better human connection with people you're working with in the community or on a project. Whew. All right. Thank you for being patient with me. The last slide is one more time to emphasize that yesterday, on Monday, the 3rd of September, I updated the Canvas assignments that are called the self-guided field trips. And you have overall about 8 to 10 pages of instructions. There's about 2 or 3 pages of instructions, and then there's details and resources about each option. So your job this week, carefully read each of the options, and I made sure to provide wiggle room for you that whether you choose 1, 2, or 3, each of them overall as a group are due the 9th of November. So you can do them all this week, you can do them all the week of November 9th, but the key thing is I've changed the due date to be respectful of your time constraints. Each one is going to take about 90 minutes, and it involves a little preparation work on your part, and review the instructions. I will, on an ongoing basis for each of them, provide more options in terms of meetings to attend or some speaker to go see, to ensure you have a range of things to choose from. But the point is, and I will end here, please read the instructions and contact me at any time if there's questions. This is your instructor, Marty, signing out, and thanks again for your work, and have a great day.